You shouldn't be hoarding water on my watch. Olivia's voice crackled through the intercom before I even saw the notice stapled to the front gate. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and at the end don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The early morning sun had just begun to climb over the rolling hills of my property, reflecting off the small reservoir behind the old stone dam my grandfather built in 1978. I could smell the earthy scent of wet soil and the faint tang of metal from the gate latch as I stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel drive, feeling the cold dew seep through the leather of my work gloves. My name is John Whitaker, and this dam has been in my family for 3 generations, a legacy built on careful planning, precise calculations, and a respect for water as both a resource and a lifeline. The wind shifted and carried with it the faint perfume of freshly cut grass from Olivia's manicured lawn just beyond the fence, her shiny white Lexus parked at the edge of her driveway like a sentinel. I watched as she paced, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, the sharp click of her heels on the concrete echoing across the morning silence. My eyes flicked to the notice nailed to the oak post, $50,004, hoarding water, the ink still glistening, official and threatening, a symbol of power wielded without understanding. The metal of the gate felt cold under my fingertips as I traced the engraved numbers, imagining every gallon of water my family had managed, every calculation that went into balancing the reservoir for the dry spells and the heavy rains, the hours of my childhood spent running along these banks, measuring the flow, counting the ducks, and learning the subtle language of moving water. I could hear the distant hum of a tractor down by the lower fields, the tires chewing through rich Texas soil, and the faint drip of water from the spillway that had been guiding the creek for decades, a rhythm as steady as my heartbeat. Olivia's voice came again, sharp and clipped, cutting through the crisp morning air, but I barely registered the words. My mind was mapping out the space, noting the angles of the dam, the height of the spillway, the paths of runoff, every detail I might use to protect what was ours. The gravel beneath my feet shifted slightly as I stepped closer to the edge, the scent of wet stone and damp moss mixing with the warm dust that had settled overnight. Sunlight glinted off the steel control valves, and for a moment, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, calm and deliberate, teaching me patience, precision, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are right, that the work you do matters, that justice can be as inevitable as gravity. Olivia tapped her pen against the clipboard, a rhythm trying to assert dominance over the still morning, and I smiled slightly, recognizing the disconnect between her confidence and the reality of what she was about to challenge. Every detail around me, the creaking wooden dam, the shimmer of water in the reservoir, the crunch of gravel under my boots, even the distant crow of a rooster, was a reminder that I was standing on land that had been tended, measured, and respected long before her entitlement began. And in that moment, as the wind tugged at the edges of the notice and the air filled with the earthy aroma of freshly disturbed soil, I knew the day would not unfold as Olivia expected. She thought the penalty alone could intimidate me, but she didn't know the foundation she was standing against, the legacy of careful calculation and foresight, the quiet power of someone who had been managing water, land, and family heritage for decades. The morning stretched, sunlight turning the reservoir silver, the hum of nature punctuated by the occasional bird call, and I took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of anticipation mixed with dew, knowing that the confrontation had only just begun and that every move I made from here on would be watched, calculated, and, eventually, returned in full measure. The story of this land begins long before my own memory reaches back to its earliest days. My grandfather, Henry Whitaker, purchased this property in the late 1950s, long before the neighborhood subdivisions sprouted like weeds along the hillsides. He built this dam in 1978, a modest structure of reinforced stone and timber, designed not for grandeur but for practicality, to collect rainwater and manage the seasonal flows that determine the fate of our pastures and crops. As a boy, I would spend summer days walking the banks of the reservoir, notebook in hand, jotting down water levels and learning the subtle behaviors of the creek as it meandered through the property. The smell of wet soil, the tang of iron from the dam gates, and the soft gurgle of water over rocks became my classroom, teaching patience, attention to detail, and the quiet satisfaction of well-managed resources. I watched as my parents maintained the property with the same respect, always measuring twice, cutting once, adjusting sluices and gates to ensure the water did not run dry or overflow into unwanted areas. Those lessons became the foundation of my understanding not only of hydrology but of responsibility and stewardship. Now, decades later, standing at the edge of the reservoir with the morning sun warming my face, I could trace each curve of the land and remember every corner where my grandfather had left his mark. The fence posts, worn smooth by generations of wind and rain, leaned slightly, evidence of time passing, yet still holding their purpose. I could hear the distant echo of birdsong and the soft whisper of the creek weaving through the property, each note a reminder that this land was alive, and that I was merely its caretaker, not its master. The scent of damp stone mixed with pine from the nearby groves, a fragrance that anchored me, grounding my thoughts as I assessed the state of the dam and the reservoir. Every detail, from the height of the spillway to the angle of the sluice gates, spoke to the years of careful planning and maintenance, the patience required to balance nature and human need. I remembered the early morning spent adjusting valves and checking for leaks, the cold water splashing my boots as I walked along the spillway, the sun rising behind the distant ridges painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Those moments were etched into my memory, shaping the person I became, instilling a respect for precision and foresight, a recognition that the consequences of inattention could ripple far beyond what was immediately visible. Even now, as I surveyed the landscape, I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing gently against my shoulders, a reminder that legacy carries both privilege and obligation. Every inch of this land told a story of dedication, discipline, and quiet triumphs, a story that had been nurtured for generations and one that I was determined to honor in every decision I made from this day forward. Olivia stepped onto the gravel path leading to the dam, clipboard held firmly, her polished shoes crunching with each step, and the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the earthy aroma of damp stone and wet moss. She was smiling in a way that made my skin crawl, that fake sweetness she wore like armor, confident that her authority was absolute, convinced that a few signatures and a large fine could bend reality to her favor. I watched her from the edge of the reservoir, feeling the morning light warm my back as the ripples on the water caught the sunlight in flashes of gold and silver. My mind catalogued every detail of her approach, the way she adjusted the binder against her chest, the slight tilt of her head, the casual flick of her hair, and I noted how completely oblivious she was to the history and precision built into this dam. This was not just a structure, it was decades of calculation, hours of maintenance, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations who understood the subtleties of water flow, seasonal variations, and how each valve affected the balance of the entire system. Olivia began reading from her clipboard, reciting violations with mechanical precision, her voice carrying over the still water, echoing off the stone walls and reflecting back to me in an almost musical cadence. Every word felt heavy with authority, but I could see the gaps in her understanding, the assumptions that had no basis in the reality of the land. I walked closer, boots sinking slightly into the damp gravel, listening carefully to the cadence of her declarations while my own thoughts mapped out contingencies and outcomes. The subtle sound of water spilling over the secondary sluice gate reminded me of lessons my grandfather had taught me: patience, observation, and the power of waiting until the moment is right. I noted the angle of the sun on the spillway, the pattern of shadows along the banks, the small eddies forming where rocks disrupted the flow, and I realized that all of these elements, long considered mundane, would become tools in the careful orchestration that was quietly forming in my mind. Olivia continued her inspection, checking measurement marks, tapping the dam gates, and scribbling notes as if her scrutiny could rewrite the law of physics, oblivious to the careful engineering and planning that had gone into every stone and valve. I felt the familiar rush of focus, a calm energy that comes from intimate knowledge of one's craft, as my eyes traced the contours of the reservoir, noting potential vulnerabilities and the safest paths for manipulating water levels without damaging the structure I had inherited. Every sound, the distant clink of a metal gate, the soft sigh of water flowing under pressure, the chirp of birds from the groves along the hillside, became part of a symphony of information I could interpret. I felt connected, grounded, and confident, knowing the land responded to careful observation and deliberate action. Olivia was immersed in her paperwork, unaware that her confidence rested on fragile assumptions and incomplete information, that her authority, impressive on paper, had no bearing on the physical reality she faced. The morning air was cool and fragrant with pine and wet soil, carrying a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on my arms stand at attention. I could see the rising tension in the muscles of my own hands as I traced imaginary lines across the water's surface, planning, calculating, preparing for the precise moment when the careful balance of knowledge, engineering, and timing would shift the advantage, quietly, undeniably, and with the inevitability that comes from generations of understanding the land and the water that flows through it. Olivia lifted her gaze from the clipboard, her eyes narrowing as she walked closer to the sluice gates, the sun glinting off the polished metal and catching the faint mist rising from the reservoir. Each step she took caused the gravel underfoot to shift and crunch, a rhythm that seemed to echo across the still water and into the quiet corners of the property. I remained at the edge of the dam, observing, cataloging her movements and noting the way her shadow stretched across the surface of the reservoir, long and distorted in the morning light. The gentle lap of water against the stone embankment provided a constant undertone, a quiet counterpoint to the high-pitched scribble of her pen as she made notes on the violation forms she had brought with her. Her voice, clipped and authoritative, recited restrictions and regulations as if mere repetition could bend reality to her will, unaware that the dam and the reservoir had been managed with exacting precision for decades. I could feel the temperature of the morning air shifting slightly as a breeze swept down the hill, carrying the scent of wet soil, pine, and the faint metallic tang of the sluice gates, and it reminded me of the countless hours my grandfather and I had spent monitoring water levels, calibrating valves, and measuring flow with patience and care. Olivia paused at the top of the dam, tapping her pen against the railing, seemingly unaware of the subtle but deliberate engineering features surrounding her, the small channels and gates that controlled the water flow, the way each valve had been positioned to maximize efficiency while preserving the structural integrity of the stonework. I could hear the distant hum of the power lines along the far edge of the property, the wind rustling through the trees, and the soft trill of birds hidden in the groves, each sound layering itself into the sensory environment that I had come to know intimately over the years. The morning light played across the surface of the reservoir, catching in tiny waves and reflecting a fractured image of the dam and the gates, and I realized that every detail she observed was filtered through her assumptions, never touching the deeper knowledge embedded in the structure itself. I stepped closer to the control lever, feeling the cool metal under my fingers, my muscles remembering the exact tension required to adjust the sluice gates safely, the precise pressure necessary to maintain balance between the upper and lower reservoir levels. Olivia continued to pace, oblivious to the fact that her authority did not extend into the physical reality she was attempting to regulate, that her printed regulations could not override decades of careful water management and inherited expertise. Every instinct I had honed over years of study, observation, and direct interaction with the dam and the surrounding land sharpened, guiding my attention to potential opportunities, to points where careful action could shift control without disturbing the integrity of the structure. The air was filled with a subtle tension, a contrast between her confidence and my quiet certainty, the soundscape of water, wind, and wildlife forming a backdrop for the silent calculation unfolding in my mind. As Olivia turned again, her pen scratching across paper, I traced the edges of the reservoir, noting the patterns of light and shadow, the gentle curves of the embankment, the placement of stones, each element part of a larger system that I understood in ways she never could. The moment felt suspended, a delicate balance between observation and preparation, anticipation and timing, with the knowledge that the land and water beneath our feet were on my side, quietly but absolutely. Despite my repeated attempts to negotiate with the homeowners association, every call, every email, and every request seemed to vanish into the void of bureaucracy. I had contacted the county water management office, explaining the historical significance of the dam and the legality of water usage on my property, providing copies of the original construction permits, and even scheduling an in-person meeting with a local official, but the responses were slow, bureaucratic, and ultimately ineffective. Each day the fine threatened to escalate, the letters piling up on my desk, the crisp aroma of fresh ink and paper a constant reminder of Olivia's rigid insistence that I was in violation. The air in my office felt thick with the weight of anticipation as I scanned each notice, noting the detailed measurements and language that suggested a deep misunderstanding of how the reservoir operated. I traced the flow calculations with my fingers over the spreadsheets, the metallic tang of the printer toner blending with the faint scent of coffee from the mug beside me, realizing that the legal tools at my disposal, though present, would require time to produce results, time that Olivia seemed unwilling to grant. I reflected on past attempts to mitigate similar disputes, recalling instances where neighborly negotiation had worked in small increments, but Olivia's assertive posture, her unwavering belief in the authority she represented, suggested that dialogue alone would not suffice. The faint hum of the water circulating through the sluices under the dam was a reminder of the precision embedded in this system, a network of engineering that required knowledge and experience to manage effectively. I considered calling my attorney again, but the costs and delays seemed disproportionate to the immediate challenge, and I knew that while legal arguments were powerful, they were slow and procedural, whereas the dam and reservoir responded instantly to physical management and controlled adjustments. I walked along the edge of the reservoir, boots pressing into the damp gravel, noting the gentle rise and fall of the water, the way sunlight caught each ripple, reflecting tiny shards of brilliance across the stone walls, and I thought about the legacy of stewardship that had been passed down to me, the responsibility to maintain balance and protect the resource, and the knowledge that patience and careful planning could yield results in ways that blunt force or bureaucracy could not. The soft rustle of leaves in the nearby trees and the occasional chirp of a distant bird became background rhythms as I reviewed my mental map of the reservoir and its channels, noting the most efficient ways to adjust flow without compromising safety or structure. I considered the consequences of every potential action, the precise timing needed, and the alignment of natural forces that could amplify a small, deliberate adjustment into a significant effect. The sunlight climbed higher, warming the stone surfaces and highlighting the fine cracks and seams in the dam that had been sealed and maintained over decades, a testament to meticulous work and constant vigilance. My mind worked methodically, weighing every variable, understanding that this challenge was not a test of confrontation but of strategy, knowledge, and timing. As I stood there, the damp scent of the earth mingling with the crisp morning air, I realized that the solutions would not come from shouting or confrontation but from a careful orchestration of all elements in play, leveraging the intricate system of water flow, the structure of the dam, and the historical authority embedded in the permits and measurements that I knew by heart, preparing silently for the moment when action would align perfectly with precision. As I dug through the stacks of old paperwork in the corner of my study, the faint scent of aged paper and ink filling the air, I came across the original construction permits for the dam, yellowed with time and carefully folded, each signature precise, each stamp authentic. My fingers traced the embossed seals, feeling the ridges of history beneath my touch, and a sense of certainty settled over me. The documents confirmed that the reservoir and dam had been engineered in consultation with federal water management authorities, a detail Olivia clearly had not considered, assuming that her local jurisdiction could override decades of planning and oversight. I reviewed the charts, the flow calculations, and the detailed notes on seasonal water distribution, understanding fully how each valve and spillway contributed to the equilibrium of the reservoir and downstream irrigation systems. The realization struck me like a current of cool water, the law, the structure, and my knowledge aligned, forming a combination of authority and precision that could not be ignored or disputed. I measured the width of the spillway, the depth of the reservoir at multiple points, and compared these figures to the specifications outlined in the permits, confirming that any action I took would be fully compliant with historical and federal regulations. The morning light filtered through the window, casting patterns across the floor, illuminating the edges of the documents, highlighting the meticulous detail of prior engineers, and reinforcing the gravity of the responsibility I carried. I ran my calculations once more, plotting the controlled release rates and timing, knowing exactly how to adjust the sluices to maintain the integrity of the dam while asserting control over the situation, leveraging the authority embedded in the permits. I considered Olivia's perspective, how her assumptions and confidence in her administrative power would not account for the layers of knowledge, regulation, and technical expertise at my disposal, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in the advantage that careful preparation provides. Each sheet of paper, each measurement, each historical note became a tool, a piece of the plan forming in my mind, a sequence of precise actions that would demonstrate control and protect the legacy of the land. The hum of the water flowing under the gates, the subtle creak of timber, and the distant calls of birds created a rhythm that guided my thought process, aligning physical observation with legal and technical certainty. I arranged the documents on the desk, positioning them for easy reference, cross-checking the flow calculations against the original permits, ensuring that every potential variable had been accounted for and that my actions would be unassailable. The scent of the earth outside, the warmth of the rising sun, and the cool touch of metal from the sluice controls reminded me that this was not just theory but a tangible system that responded to careful intervention. With each adjustment, I could anticipate the consequences, the water responding immediately to changes in gate positions, validating the knowledge accumulated through decades of observation, engineering, and stewardship. The confidence grew within me, steady and measured, knowing that I had discovered the critical leverage point that would allow me to act decisively while remaining completely within the bounds of law and technical expertise, turning preparation into power without haste, without error, and with absolute clarity of purpose. With the plans fully in place and the calculations double-checked, I returned to the dam, feeling the cool morning breeze against my face, carrying the scent of wet stone, pine, and the faint ozone from the reservoir. Every step along the gravel path reinforced the rhythm I had memorized from years of walking these banks, each crunch of rock underfoot aligning with the mental map of gates, channels, and spillways I had constructed. I approached the main control lever, fingers brushing the cold steel, remembering the exact tension required to adjust the sluice gates without compromising the integrity of the dam. Olivia was still nearby, her attention absorbed in rechecking her forms, her pen moving across the paper with methodical determination, oblivious to the readiness of the system around her. I adjusted my stance, feeling the solid ground beneath my boots, the slight vibration of the water through the stoneworks, and the subtle shift in air as the reservoir breathed under the rising sun. My hands moved deliberately, manipulating the primary valve with the precision I had rehearsed mentally, each click of the gear and hiss of water confirming that the flow was responding exactly as planned. I observed the minor ripples forming downstream, the gentle expansion of the water into the small channels, and the way the light danced on the surface, catching the movement as if the reservoir itself was acknowledging the alignment of calculation and action. The quiet hum of the wind through the surrounding trees and the soft calls of birds provided a natural metronome, marking each step of the process as I monitored the precise measurements I had taken from the permits and engineering notes. Olivia glanced up occasionally, her eyes scanning the reservoir, but her focus remained tethered to her clipboard, her assumptions about compliance and authority still unchallenged by the reality unfolding around her. I continued the controlled adjustments, noting every subtle movement of the water, each eddy and flow pattern that confirmed my predictions, the reservoir responding perfectly to decades of inherited knowledge and meticulous planning. I felt the anticipation build as the system reached its intended state, a silent alignment of all factors, natural and human, poised on the edge of the moment when observation would transition into consequence. Every stone of the dam, every inch of the spillway, every drop of water was participating in a carefully orchestrated plan, a harmony of structure, regulation, and timing. I stepped back slightly, observing the entirety of the reservoir and its channels, confirming that each adjustment had been executed with precision, the system stable yet fully prepared to demonstrate the authority embedded in its design. The air felt electric with the subtle energy of controlled potential, the morning sunlight warm on my shoulders, and the sounds of the environment, the gentle lap of water, the whisper of leaves, the distant hum of wildlife, forming an auditory landscape that underscored the quiet power of preparation. In that moment, every observation, every measurement, every calculated action converged, creating a readiness that was complete, deliberate, and undeniable, setting the stage for the inevitable unfolding of consequences that would validate decades of stewardship, expertise, and careful planning. The first hint of movement appeared downstream as the controlled release began to flow along the channels, glinting in the morning sun and catching Olivia's attention. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized the water levels were adjusting more quickly than she had anticipated, the gentle hum of the sluice gates now accompanied by a soft ripple across the surface of the reservoir. I watched from the dam, hands steady on the control lever, feeling the subtle vibrations through the steel and stone as the water responded exactly as planned. Each sluice valve adjusted the flow incrementally, guiding the water along precise paths that I had charted from decades of observation and the detailed engineering notes inherited from my grandfather. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp stone and wet pine, mixing with the faint metallic tang of the sluices in operation. Olivia shuffled papers, her movements becoming more urgent, a faint rustle echoing against the stone walls, while her focus wavered between the forms in her hands and the unexpected rise of water along the edges of the reservoir. I monitored every ripple, every minor change, noting how the channels were filling in sequence, the reflective surfaces catching the sunlight in sharp flashes, the small waves expanding in harmony with the calculations I had confirmed earlier. The gravel paths along the banks shifted slightly under the influence of the rising water, each sound amplified in the quiet morning, reminding me of the power of small, deliberate adjustments. Olivia's footsteps became hesitant, her clipboard almost slipping in her hands as she took in the unfolding scene, the mechanical authority of her printed rules suddenly feeling inadequate against the physical certainty of the dam and the water it controlled. I observed the minor eddies forming near the spillways, each one a confirmation that the flow was proceeding exactly as predicted, the gentle force of water interacting with the channel walls in a way that required no further intervention from me, a validation of careful planning, precise calculation, and inherited knowledge. The sunlight reflected off the moving surface in shifting patterns, illuminating the structure of the dam, the channels, and the surrounding banks, highlighting the meticulous attention that had gone into maintaining equilibrium, and emphasizing the contrast between the quiet effectiveness of preparation and the reactive confusion of someone unprepared. Olivia's voice wavered slightly as she called out observations, her sentences trailing off in uncertainty, her authority undermined by the evidence of physical reality playing out before her eyes. I adjusted the final sluice, a subtle turn of the lever, and the last portion of water moved as intended, completing the controlled sequence and demonstrating that every measure had been accounted for. The hum of flowing water, the rustle of leaves, and the glinting sunlight formed a sensory confirmation of success, a tangible payoff for careful observation, deliberate planning, and precise execution. As I stepped back, letting the full effect of the adjustment become visible, I could see the moment of realization settle over Olivia's expression, her carefully curated confidence replaced with astonishment, a quiet acknowledgement that the authority she assumed was secondary to the meticulous balance and inherited expertise that governed the reservoir and its dam. The morning had settled into a steady rhythm, the sunlight glinting off the surface of the reservoir and illuminating the dam in a warm glow that highlighted the meticulous work embedded in every stone and gate. Olivia stood at the edge of the water, clipboard now forgotten in her hand, her expression a mix of astonishment and reluctant acknowledgement as the controlled flow demonstrated the exact authority and precision that she had assumed she could override. I walked along the gravel path, boots crunching softly, noting the subtle reflections in the water, the gentle ripples expanding outward, each one a testament to careful planning, inherited knowledge, and the quiet power of preparation. The channels carried the water precisely as intended, feeding the lower banks and irrigation paths, showing the full effectiveness of decades of accumulated expertise. The faint scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of the sluices, reinforcing the presence of an environment both natural and engineered, a landscape where patience and understanding could wield more influence than force or intimidation. I paused at the crest of the dam, looking down at the orderly flow, appreciating the harmony between human engineering and nature, the alignment of historical permits, technical calculations, and deliberate execution. Olivia's movements slowed, her shoulders dropping slightly as she recognized that the authority she had tried to exert on paper was insufficient in the face of tangible expertise, the realization settling over her like the morning mist. The sunlight danced on the water's surface, highlighting each ripple and reflecting the meticulous structure beneath, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that every action had unfolded exactly as planned, each detail accounted for and executed with precision. The distant calls of birds and the soft rustle of leaves provided a subtle soundtrack to the scene, emphasizing the contrast between the calm, calculated approach of preparation and the reactive uncertainty of someone unprepared. I stepped back to take in the full view of the reservoir and surrounding dam, noting the alignment of light, water, and structure, each element confirming the successful orchestration of resources and timing. The morning air was filled with a sense of completion, the quiet triumph of strategy executed flawlessly, the weight of responsibility carried responsibly, and the undeniable validation of inherited knowledge and technical skill. Every aspect of the property, from the spillways to the embankments, responded exactly as intended, demonstrating the effectiveness of careful planning and control. Olivia finally stepped aside, the tension in her posture easing as she witnessed the results of the precise adjustments, the water flowing smoothly and predictably, every variable accounted for, every potential challenge addressed. I allowed myself a deep breath, tasting the crisp morning air, feeling the sun on my back, and appreciating the quiet power of preparation and expertise as the water continued its measured path, a living testament to the enduring combination of patience, skill, and inherited authority. Standing there, observing the reservoir and the orderly channels, I realized that the day had unfolded exactly as it should, a tangible demonstration that foresight, knowledge, and careful action can achieve results far beyond the reach of simple authority, leaving the landscape, the dam, and the water itself as undeniable evidence of what can be accomplished when preparation meets opportunity.